Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We're so excited to be giving some information on adaptive PE, adaptive physical education today, and the approaches that can really empower all students to be able to participate and succeed and thrive in physical education in their PE class if they have disabilities that might prevent that from being possible in a general PE classroom. My name is Crystal Ash. I am part of our special education team here at Altman Law. I do a lot of our webinars, and I also work in our other curricular activities. So anything that we see go out, that's probably got my name on it. And then I've got here Sarah Lotak with us as well. She's one of our special education advocates on the team. We've got a couple of things that we want to cover tonight. So our webinar is really going to dive into three areas. We're going to first define what adaptive physical education, or APE, is under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Then we're going to look to kind of explain what exactly that means and what it looks like in practice. So eligibility, assessments, the services that a student can get for APE, kind of what this looks like in the classroom or the gym, I should say. And then we'll look to identify some collaboration strategies. So how you can work with your school team or how your school team can work with you to make sure that your student who needs APE is, getting the maximum programming that is appropriate for them, and some examples of inclusive PE adaptations as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to start walking us through the foundations of APE.
Thank you, Crystal. And yes, I'm going to talk about the foundation. So first, I'll talk about what IDEA outlines as far as physical education, and then APE, or adaptive physical education. So first, for physical education, we need to note that it's a direct service, not a related service. So that means that it must be provided to every child with a disability as part of their educational program, just like reading or math would be included. However, under IDEA, adaptive physical education is that specially designed instruction. So for students who cannot safely or successfully participate in that general PE class without modifications, we would then look to APE to see if that would be appropriate for them. It's important to note that AP is not a substitute or an optional activity. It's part of ensuring access to the general curriculum and also FAPE for that student. And the IEP team determines if the student requires APE based on data and evaluation. Okay, so what is adaptive PE? Adaptive PE is a modified physical education curriculum designed to meet the individual needs of a student with a disability. It focuses on promoting physical fitness, motor skills, coordination, balance, and social participation through adaptive methods. And it can include accommodation. So think like modified equipment or adjusted rules or game structures, smaller class sizes or specialized settings, and then individual teaching techniques or assistive technology. The goal is to ensure equal access and meaningful participation and progress in physical education. So let's talk about who would qualify for APE. Students with a disability that impact their ability to participate in general PE safely or successfully, even with accommodations. So eligibility is determined through a comprehensive evaluation, which will assess those areas that I discussed. So gross and fine motor skills, strength and balance, coordination, endurance, some of those sensory motor integrations, and ability to follow multi-step directions. They may receive APE in addition to or in place of general PE, depending on the needs of that student. And then we're going to talk about who can provide APE. So depending on states' requirements for certification or endorsement, APE is delivered by a qualified adaptive physical education teacher. Collaboration is key. So we want to make sure that they are working closely with Gen Ed teachers, special ed teachers, OTs, PTs, to make sure there's consistency across environments. And we know that in some districts, general physical education teachers may implement the program. However, they need to be under the supervision from a certified APE specialist. Okay, let's talk about the evaluation process. So typically it starts with a referral, and like all areas of special education, anyone with knowledge or concern about a student's physical education performance or how they're doing, how they're progressing in physical education can make a referral. So this includes teachers, parents, therapists, or administrators. A referral is typically made when a student is unable to participate meaningfully or safely in the general PE setting, even with accommodations. And then once referred, the school must follow standard special education evaluation procedures and timelines under IDEA. As far as the assessment goes, it's usually conducted by a qualified APE specialist and may include other professionals, so OT, PT, teachers, etc. The evaluation may include gross and fine motor skills, balance and coordination, endurance, strength, sensory motor integration, behavioral needs, social needs, and will also include observations in the general ed PE settings to determine how the student performs alongside their peers and where those adaptations are needed. The assessment may also use some standardized tools as well as those informal observations, teacher input, and data. And lastly, documentation. So results are, all the evaluation results should be used to summarize and should be summarized in a written report that includes the strengths, the needs, and the level of performance in physical education for that student. And it should clearly state whether that student requires that specially designed instruction in phys ed, which would lead to obviously them being qualified for adapted physical education. And then the plan development. So most importantly, then the IEP team determines that the student requires APE and then documents that in the IEP with frequency, duration, and setting of services, and then supports that by measurable annual goals, focusing on that physical, motor, and participation skills. Okay, service delivery and placement. So we want to make sure we're following the continuum of services. So we have direct APE services, which are individual or small group instructions targeting those specific motor or physical education goals. We also have consultative or collaborative, where the APE specialist works with the general ed PE teachers or physical therapists or OTs and other staff to adapt the curriculum, modify activities, and support inclusion. And then we have inclusion with supports, right? So that's where the student is participating in general PE with accommodations, modified equipment, peer support, or a paraprofessional assisting that student. We want to talk about least restrictive and that consideration, right? We want to make sure when we're discussing LRE, we're looking at data to support what's the LRE for that student in regards to physical education. The IEP team would use evaluation results and ongoing data to determine the LRE and the level of APE support needed. So services, again, must be delivered in the least restrictive environment that allows that student to make progress and participate. So this could range from full inclusion in general PE with supports to a separate APE setting when necessary. And again, the goal is always access and participation alongside peers to the greatest extent appropriate. And collaboration and communication. I know I touched on this a few times. This is arguably one of the most important parts of APE, right? So we want to make sure that there's a team approach. There's collaboration amongst the APE teacher, general PE teacher, occupational therapists, physical therapists, classroom teachers, and parents. We also want to make sure there's some professional development for all staff to better understand APE needs and how to generalize those skills throughout that student setting. We want them to be modeling and giving, and we want feedback from that APE teacher, from the OT, from the PT to understand that student's needs and how to best implement those accommodations appropriately. And lastly, we want to collaborate with the family to make sure the family's engaged in that child's programming, that strategies are consistent and that there's carryover between home and school so that that student is also starting to generalize those skills outside of just the APE environment.
I think this also points out a really good, kind of overlooked portion of APE, especially because, when we probably think of special education, we think of classroom accommodations and academic accommodations or behavioral accommodations. And when you kind of think about APE out of context and you think of, oh, well, that's in the gym, that's not in the classroom, that's not education, the same way that we might think of academic accommodations or academic concepts as education. I think APE can really get lost in the shuffle of, the fact that this is special education. This is the same IEP team that's going to be addressing, any academic goals that your student might have, or how other students may have an IEP team for academic goals. If APE is all that your student needs, it's still all the same thing. So it's really kind of a misconception, I feel like, when we come to APE. If it's something that somebody doesn't know about, they might not realize that, they're eligible for it, or that it even is something that you could be eligible for in special education, because that hard line we sometimes draw in our minds between what is and isn't education. Our PE classes, our related classes like music and art, I feel like sometimes can fall to the wayside. But this really highlights that, this is special education. This is something that your school and your school team and your IEP team should be keeping in mind if you have a student with a physical disability, and how that really highlights, this is something that you might be eligible for and might be able to have included in your students' programming if that's something that they might need.
Yes.
So that kind of leads us into our best practices. Now that we kind of have an understanding of what it is and how it becomes and how it gets into programming, or how you might be eligible for it, whenever we do have a student who's eligible for APE, there are, just like all other areas of education and special education, some best practices that we typically see APE programs or accommodations following. So it kind of falls into three different categories. Our first one is instructional strategies. So this is when, you think of an accommodation, this is probably what you're thinking of. Some differentiation between, tasks and maybe what a student in the general PE classroom might be doing versus what a student with APE programming might need. So for example, if you have a student who has a physical disability that limits their ability to grip, and the regular general education classroom is um, practicing basketball, right? And that's a throwing, that's catching, that's gripping, but your student struggles with grip because of their physical disability. Differentiation would look like, okay, how can we adapt basketball? If there's a struggle with gripping, maybe this student doesn't catch and throw. Maybe the student just dribbles because that's just bouncing, that's just hitting the ball against the floor. So there's no grip involved there. So changing up what exactly is happening in these physical tasks to make them more accessible. It can also look like peer supports and buddy systems. So if you have a student who struggles with instructions or working within a team, and that is something that they need further accommodation for, peer support, making sure that there are trusted peers on their team, or having them have a buddy who is, really good with instructions that can help support them in that way, especially in our, team sports that we often see children learning in PE, or group activities like dodgeball, where it's all of us all at the same time playing a game or doing an activity. Having some direct peer support, or a buddy to help them navigate that situation, can be a great way to kind of differentiate and accommodate that need. And then if we do also have, any physical, like a visual support or a written routine, or a verbal reinforcement, something that's a little bit more directly accommodating, like we may think of it for general education classes, those are also great instructional strategies to use. So having, the rules for the game written out and posted on the wall before we play, or if there are visual cues for a game that a student can learn and can be reinforced so that they can, very quickly just kind of, center themselves in that game, and kind of come back to the focus if they're starting to struggle. Those more direct accommodations are great to use as instructional strategies as well. Then we move into equipment and environment. So like Sarah touched on earlier, this can include modifications to curriculum in the form of changing either the environment that the student learns that skill or practices that skill or plays that game in, and the equipment that they use to do it. So like our example about basketball, if we have a student who struggles to grip, maybe they are, given a different type of ball to practice with, or they are able to practice in a different area of the gym, or something that changes that equipment that they're given and the environment that they are learning in to modify that curriculum. This also includes accessibility considerations in the gym. So for our students who use wheelchairs or who might have sensory processing issues where the bright lights and the squeaking of the sneakers on the floor and the, shouts of the other children, if that might be overwhelming, changing that environment, changing the equipment to accommodate the student's disability, and really taking accessibility into consideration, because typically, unlike a classroom, a gym can be set up in a lot of different ways. There can be bleachers, there can be, stairs up to a certain area, and just making sure that, we understand this student's needs and adapting the gym itself, the environment itself, to being more accessible to them. And then if a student does have very specialized needs, so like I said, my example earlier, a student in a wheelchair, if there is any specialized equipment that is needed because of their disability, that can be included in equipment and environment as well as a best practice. And then as we implement all of these best practices, our strategies and our modifications and our accommodations, data collection is also a really important piece of our best practice for APE. So like other areas of special education, there should be data collected on these accommodations and modifications, and progress monitoring is going to be a really important part of ensuring that a student's APE programming is appropriate and effective for them. So making sure that we're monitoring progress regularly, laid out by the provisions in the IEP, making sure we're looking for performance-based measures that are appropriate to the students' needs and the accommodations that are put in place to meet them. And then that we're always, just like all other areas of special education, making data-driven decisions, because it's not enough to just see that we have a student in a wheelchair and assume that they just need a ramp to get into the gym, or, to know that this student struggles with grip, so we don't give them catching and throwing activities. We need to be documenting, how their accommodations are working, and we need to be using that data to make data-driven decisions. So now that we have an understanding, we're kind of leaning into our case review. This is something that we love to do, especially for niche topics like this, where, we can talk all day about what it looks like and what it means. But at the end of the day, having a more concrete example of these types of topics can be really helpful in understanding if your child might be eligible or how these concepts could apply to your life. So we've got 4 examples here, just made up examples, not based on any individual in particular, of some regular, scenes that we might see when it comes to a student who may qualify for APE or has APE and is having questions about that. So we'll kind of go through these. Sarah and I will talk about them, kind of give our commentary on it, and then we'll move on to the next portion of our webinar. So our first one at the very top there, this example is a child has low muscle tone in their legs due to a physical disability. The parents have concerns over participation in PE, but don't know how to go about requesting APE. So in this case, what would they do? How would they go about requesting APE? Kind of what's the process there?
Right. And this would be no different than requesting any evaluation for special education, right? So if there's concerns specifically with whether this child would qualify for APE or needs APE in order to make meaningful progress in physical education, the parents should submit a written request for an APE evaluation under IDEA. I say written, everything should be documented and written. We stress that all the time. And the request can also note the concerns about how that child's disability affects their participation in PE. Assuming the child may be getting physical therapy too, the parent can also reach out to the school physical therapist and see if that staff member supports the need for APE as well, or an evaluation to determine whether that child would qualify for needing APE. And then the school would respond with a PWN, a prior written notice, on whether they are proceeding with the evaluation process. And then that evaluation would fall under, again, would have to follow the timeline under IDEA and will include a comprehensive evaluation. So again, looking at observations, maybe some standardized assessments, and then a review of data from their participation in PE thus far, and also speaking to other staff members, their gen ed teacher, special ed teacher, and again, if they're getting PT, OT, seeing the data and seeing if the data supports the need for APE.
And, additionally, if this is a student maybe who's new to the district or a very young student who maybe didn't have programming previously through special education, if you aren't sure who to reach out to, even though we know what to say and what to request, a couple of different ways you could go about that. You can just get in contact with the student's general PE teacher, tell them your concerns, ask them if they can point you in the direction of a special education coordinator or something like that. And you can always reach out to your school's administration with these types of concerns. If they are not necessarily, your child's assistant principal or your child's guidance counselor, they would know who to point you in the direction of, and that written request still stands. That's notice to the school that you've got concerns that may need to be addressed by special education. So that can kind of help it work through the proper channels if you might be new to a school or new to special education and you don't have a contact yet. Our, excuse me, our second one. This is a child with muscular dystrophy, and this child is wheelchair bound but has strong use of their upper body. What types of APE accommodations would be appropriate for a student in this situation?
Okay, I'll start. So without obviously knowing the whole profile of this child, some appropriate accommodations could be maybe like larger, more lightweight balls if they're working on ball skills, maybe some lowered nets or adjustable targets, obviously, because the student's in a wheelchair. It could also be some environmental supports. So maybe there's ramps or assistive devices for balls. Some obviously a level playing surface would be appropriate for this student. So if they're going outside on the gravel, maybe that would be not appropriate for that student. We would make sure that obviously safety would be taken into consideration too when talking about those environmental supports.
This is a great example of when, those best practices in environment or equipment would probably become appropriate, because that's really, like Sarah said, if there's a safety component with the use of their wheelchair on different surfaces or in different activities, and then if they do, only have use of their upper body and not their lower body, of course, that would change the types of equipments that they can use, and what activities would be appropriate for them, and how to accommodate them would definitely change. So considering the environment and the equipment, those are the kinds of accommodations that we would look for to become appropriate for a student like this. Our third example, a child with developmental delay, and if we're not familiar with the special education terms, developmental delay is typically a term used for younger children who have cognition issues, intellectual disabilities, just too young to diagnose specifically with anything, in particular, but there is a significant delay in their developmental level in some way. So a child with developmental delay loves to be active, but struggles to learn the rules and procedures for PE games. Would APE be appropriate in this type of a situation?
So it depends, right? We want to consider LRE, obviously, but AP could provide that more specialized, structured environment. So maybe that student would need that in order to make meaningful progress in relation to the rules and procedures in a typical PE setting. The student could also remain in PE with some.
Well, I think Sarah froze, but I think I know what she was going to say. That this is a great time to exercise that continuum of placements and of services. So of course, thinking of the least restrictive environment, we want a student to stay in the least restrictive environment, which would be that general PE class, and we want them to have accommodations appropriate to their level of need. So if APE, going into that specialized environment or using that specialized equipment, if that's not necessarily appropriate for them, they could still have accommodations for, like the buddy system or for visual charts on rules or certain teaching strategies to help them learn the rules that would be in that continuum, trying all of those things first before going to that more restrictive model of the true APE, like we've been discussing it in this case. It's absolutely a possibility that the student would work through that continuum and it would end up that they would need APE, but it's not necessarily always APE or nothing. There can be
Right.
some accommodations worked in that general environment through that continuum
Yeah.
before a student ends up in a traditional APE model.
Right. And I also want to add that APE can bridge the gap between learning and participation, but not necessarily replace general PE, right? So we want to make sure we're thinking of it that way, that it's not a replacement for general PE.
Absolutely. And then our last one, our fourth example, a child with an autoimmune disorder can sometimes participate regularly in general PE and they sometimes can't, depending on if their illness is flaring. Can adapted PE be set up on an as needed basis?
Absolutely, if that's what's appropriate for that child, right? So maybe they have direct APE during those flare-ups and then general PE participation with accommodations during times when that child is more stable. That can absolutely be implemented within the IEP.
This is reminiscent too for me of like an intermittent homebound option.
Mhm.
If a student who has a certain disability or a certain illness that sometimes has them need to stay home or be hospitalized, there are those intermittent homebound options that can set that up academically to where they either get, that instruction through an online version of the school or with a tutor, or they have those homebound hours provided later. APE is also flexible in that way, where, like I said in our last example, it's not APE or nothing. And like Sarah said, it's a bridge for some of these gaps that we would see for students who may fall between the cracks if APE and accommodations for PE in general were not an option. So, like all other areas of special education, this is an individualized service. It goes on their individualized education program, so there is some flexibility in meeting the students' needs and kind of what that model looks like and what they might need and what might be appropriate for them. All right, so this brings us to our Q&A portion of our webinar. We do have a chat feature as well as an actual Q&A feature on the call that we're in right now, and I'm going to be looking at that so you get my right profile. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them either in the chat or in the Q&A so that Sarah and I can kind of discuss any particular questions you have. It could be anything that we've discussed already, or if there is a situation that you're going through, obviously for your privacy, don't, give us your private details, but if you have a very general question about something maybe you've seen or you've heard, or that your child might be going through, please feel free to, drop us a question in the Q&A and we can talk about those now. Well, Sarah, while we wait for our guests to maybe have a chance to think up and write them down, is there any question that you typically have from the families that you advocate for when it comes to APE?
I think the biggest when it comes to APE, I think a lot of families just don't even realize that that's a service that's potentially allotted to them or that their child may need. I don't think it's ever it's not frequently discussed, right, in IEP meetings or between teacher conferences and parents that that's even something that's available to their child. So I think the biggest thing is just education, right? families learning that this is something that their child may need and that it could be something that's very successful and that they can make meaningful progress in. But that would be the biggest kind of area that I see being a hurdle, is just not having the knowledge that this is a service that their child may need and that the school has to provide it.
Absolutely. And I've actually seen hurdles firsthand as well in the schools before of students who require adaptive mobility. So maybe a gait
Mhm.
belt, or I've seen an adaptive trike before. And exactly like what you said, the team has gone through the motions of knowing that this student needs those supports in their physical therapy sessions with the school PT, or, just in general, but the APE conversation is left off the table, even though it's obvious that this student has adaptive mobility support in other areas of the school, but we actually haven't discussed how that looks in the PE classroom and, what additional supports other than those actual physical mobility aids may be necessary for this student. And,
Right.
I know we touched on it earlier how this is part of the IEP team. It is part of the IEP discussion. And if you don't know what you don't know, but it's definitely something that if your, student struggles with any type of physical disability or any mobility issues, or even like our examples earlier, just like grip strength or muscle
Mhm.
tone, those are all indicators that if, especially if they're already receiving support in other areas, these are all indicators that it may be time to start the conversation about APE with your IEP team.
Absolutely.
Alrighty, well, I don't see any Q&As in our Q&A. That's totally okay. If you do end up having any questions or need any support with APE in the future, we do have a intake team who can schedule a consultation with you. We have an intake referral code for you tonight. That's going to be KALPE 25. So KALPE 25. If you reference that when you call in to have an intake, even if it's not about adaptive PE, I would think it might be if you're here tonight, but like we said, APE is an IEP team issue. It is a general education or a special education issue. So if you've got other special education needs or other IEP needs, we would still be happy for you to reach out. And again, that's KALPE 25 for a discounted intake session. And then this is our contact information. You can always reach us by phone or by email, and you can also visit us online either at our website or on our social media handles. And if you enjoyed our discussion tonight, or if you have worked with us before or work with us in the future, we always really appreciate reviews on our Google page, which that QR code leads to. But I know I've really enjoyed talking about APE tonight. It is definitely a niche topic that, we don't see explained or spoken about or brought up a lot unless a student is exhibiting an emergent need. So I love to, talk about things like this and kind of spread the word on some lesser known topics within special education. So we appreciate you coming out tonight. If there's anything we can further assist with, please do not hesitate to reach out and contact us. And we will always have more webinars in the future, so we'll hope that you'll come back and learn some more from us.